Hello again. This is Michael Dolan, Mahayogi. We're continuing with our series of lectures on the Mahabharata. So in our last talk, we discussed Vyas. And we were talking about how Vyas is the greatest storyteller ever. He can be compared with Homer, but if you think about it, Homer has a much more controlled time frame. His story of the Iliad, for example, deals with a 10-day period where Achilles is sulking in his tent and refuses to fight, and then in the end changes his mind and comes back to the battle. But Achilles' motives are not noble motives. He's motivated by ego, anger, lust for power, revenge. Whereas the Mahabharata has a very deep and metaphysical core. The Mahabharata story, then, is the greatest story ever told. If you think about it, Vyas is the greatest storyteller, and the Mahabharata is the greatest story. You can make a comparison with literature of the Western world, including the Bible, Homer, and Shakespeare, but these are really left behind by the Mahabharata. At 100,000 Sanskrit verses, it's longer than these three combined. And there's no Western literature that touches the deeper themes of the Mahabharata, which include karma and dharma, the arrow of time, the creation of the universe, ethics, the path to enlightenment. As a history, Mahabharata includes the stories of all the great kings of India since the beginning of time and covers many different races of people throughout India and stretching as far east as Cambodia, as far west as Persia and perhaps even Greece, who were referred to as the Mlechas, and as far north as Russia. Now, the themes of the Mahabharata are profound, but the structure of the Mahabharata is also interesting in that there's a certain sense in which it may be seen as being infinite. Of course, there's different kinds of infinite, but the infinity I'm referring to here is frames within frames. If you're sitting in the barber chair and you look into the mirror, sometimes the barber has a mirror in the back of your head, and you can see multiple reflections that regress infinitely. So it is with the Mahabharata, because it involves a number of different frame stories. In fact, there's so many frame stories that as you read the Mahabharata, you become lost in a kind of alternate universe in space and time. For example, Arjuna found that a day with the gods may last 10 years of time on Earth, in this way discovering Einsteinian relativity 1,000 years before Einstein. And reading the Mahabharata, we discover ourselves as time travelers as well. We find that through the imagination and with the help of the transcendental literature of the Mahabharata, time travel is possible, not only physically but metaphysically. We see ourselves unraveling the past lives and karma of so many of the different characters, and by identifying with them, we travel back into the past to discover their past lives. The work contains so many different digressions and frame stories used to illustrate this greater theme that we find ourselves wandering through a hall of mirrors whose images reveal the phenomenon of infinite regression. And as long as we're making comparisons with other different literatures in the Western canon, we could take a look at the 1001 Nights of Scheherazade and see that the literary techniques which are pioneered by Vyas later permeate such Oriental narratives as 1001 Nights. It's very interesting to note that the Mahabharata is the first book that goes meta. In other words, Vyas is not only a character in the book, but he also writes the book, so he's commenting on his own character. And this is another form of infinite regression, or espejismo in the words of Jorge Luis Borges. So, if you think about the 1001 Nights, there's an interesting example of infinite regression there. Everyone knows the story of the virgin girl, Scheherazade. She entertains a sadistic and murderous king with her tales of adventure. And the 1001 Nights themselves contain a number of stories within stories, or frame stories. But why is it called 1001 Nights? Well, the Argentinian literary critic Jorge Luis Borges reminds us that the one night in the title refers to the night on which Scheherazade is exhausted. She can't think of another story to tell. She's entertained the king for 1,000 nights with her stories. But the moment she runs out of interesting tales to entertain the king, she will be raped along with her sister and murdered. So she comes to the 1001st night, and she doesn't have any more stories to tell. So Scheherazade's very clever. She begins to tell the story her own. She begins to tell the king her own story. And in this way she says, well, tonight I have a different story for you. Here's my story. Once upon a time there was a girl named Scheherazade. And she begins recounting her own life up until the point where she's asked to entertain the king. And she says, I began to tell the king a series of stories. And she begins with the first story. And then she tells the story of Aladdin. And then she tells the story of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. And she continues in this way until she gets to the 1001st night, where she begins to tell her own story. And so, by telling stories within stories, she discovers the infinite story within a story. In other words, Scheherazade creates a kind of Mobius strip of tales, an endless loop, where every 1,000 nights she recapitulates her own story. So, Jorge Luis Borges called the 1001 Nights a labyrinth of labyrinths, a circular novel of endless concatenations, an infinite and circular story, un cuento circular y infinito. And with his use of frame stories, Vyasa's Mahabharata anticipates the 1001 Nights by over 1,000 years. So, of course, the book itself is not infinite. It's 100,000 verses long. But just as the 1001 Nights, 1,000 years later, the text doubles back on itself like a Mobius strip through its different versions. Let me give you a visual. This is a Russian doll. So, inside the Russian doll, if we open it up, you can see there's another doll, a little smaller. So this is something like the structure of the Mahabharata. For example, we know the Mahabharata is written by Vyas, but Vyas begins by citing Sutta Goswami. Sutta Goswami speaks the Mahabharata before the 10,000 sages gathered in Naimisharanya. But Sutta Goswami is repeating the version of Mahabharata that he heard from Vaishampayana Rishi. And Vaishampayana Rishi is, of course, describing the Mahabharata as it was told to him by Vyasadeva. Vyasadev's Mahabharata begins by explaining the history of the ancient kings of India, but he refers back to different sages, for example, Maitreya. And Maitreya will recount a conversation that took place with some ancient sage. That sage will refer back to the previous life of another character in the Mahabharata or another sage. And that sage will remember the words of Brahma or Narada or another ancient prophet or sage who will in turn tell a different story. And as we cycle back through these different stories, we'll come back to Vyasadeva. And so this sort of structure of espehismo, or the Russian doll structure, where there's one doll inside another doll, and one frame story within another frame story, has a dizzying effect on the reader. And as we contemplate how these different tales unfold in different lives with different characters, we begin to discover the infinite character of the book itself. Now, this has given any number of difficulties to different critics and scholars over time, because they try to find where is the beginning of the great epic. If we look at the complete story of the Mahabharata as 100,000 verses in Sanskrit, we'll find some things that don't seem to really fit in. And so scholars try to understand what was the core, what was the original story. And many of them believe, well, the original version of Vyas was called Jai, and must have been a kind of an ur-text of about 5,000 to 7,000 verses. And that's why every chapter in the Mahabharata begins with Narayanam Namaskrityam Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Udirayat. It says Tato Jayam Udirayat. Jai should be spoken. Only after proper respect has been shown to Nara Narayan, the goddess of learning Saraswati, and Vyas. So some people interpret this Tato Jayam Udirayat, the idea that Jai should be spoken, And they say that what is meant here is not saying Jai to Vyas, Naranarayan, and Saraswati, but the original book itself was called Jai, or something like victory, triumph, glory. And that the meaning of this verse is that after properly respecting God, the gods, and Vyas, one can recite the book called Jai. And these critics try to argue that the original epic poem was something called Jai, and went on for something like 7,000 to 8,000 verses and told the story of the Battle of Kurukshetra. So some people try to take this approach and separate the battle itself from the rest of the book. But this is very, very difficult to do, because at every step we encounter these frame stories. For example, when Karna is on the battlefield and his chariot wheel is stuck in the mud, Arjuna comes to attack him. And Karna says, well, this is unfair. You're violating the rules of war. You're not supposed to attack someone when he's unarmed and off his chariot. But the narrator takes us back in time to when Karna was studying in the ashram of the great warrior Parashuram. And Parashuram asks him, are you a Brahmin? And Karna, of course, tells him, well, not exactly. He gives a sketchy version of his birth. Of course, Karna is the son of the sun god. And when he was born, his mother Kunti floated him in a basket down the sacred river, where he was discovered by a Sutta, a chariot driver, and his wife Radha. So he became known as Radheya, the son of Radha. But he doesn't tell this to Parashuram. He hints that he may be a Brahmin, but he's not really sure about his background. So Parashuram accepts him as a student, but one day when he's with his guru, it becomes clear that he's lying, that he's really a Kshatriya, a warrior. And so Parashuram curses Karna that when he most needs his weapons, he won't be able to use them, and that he will be killed in a moment of helplessness. So that Arjuna's execution of Karna follows the karmic curse given by Parashuram. Well, this whole story appears at the moment when Arjuna is attacking Karna. So a critic might say, well, we don't really need this story. We'll just carry the action. Here's Arjuna, here's Karna, they fight, Karna's killed. But this defies the structure of the Mahabharata, because it is a kind of Russian doll. You have to observe the infinite concatenation, the infinite regression of one doll into the other. You can't just look at the big doll and say, well, okay, well, that's it, that's the story. I could show you a big doll and say, okay, this is the Mahabharata. It's the story of a battle. But without taking a look at the internal aspect of the work, we lose the real beauty of the Mahabharata, which is to take us through all these different infinite regressions, backwards and forwards in karma and time, so that trying to reduce the epic to 5,000 or 7,000 verses and calling it a poem about a battle is a very superficial view. So you have to really keep in mind then that you have this story about a battle, but it's been edited by Vaishampayana, who gives a more expanded version at the sacrifice of Janamejaya. Vaishampayana's version is later repeated by Sutta Goswami, and later edited by Vyasa again. And this is the Mahabharata we have. So the complete Mahabharata then shows us a definite kind of Borgian espehismo, or infinite and circular regression, in far more subtle ways than can be imagined, not only through space and time, but also through its description of karma. And if the story itself is folding into itself an infinite regression, it also teaches an understanding of karma through the very form of the book. Some books are intended to teach you something simply by their very form and structure. So the story of the Mahabharata is interesting, but its form is also something to be taken into consideration. And this infinite regression aspect, the idea that within every action there's a former action. And if we begin with the tiny, tiny doll in the very center of the matrushka, we see how that tiny doll grows and expands until it reaches full expression in the larger matryoshka. So the seed of karma continues to grow. And this form or structure of the Mahabharata gives it a very powerful message. It's also something like the ancient pyramids of Mexico. Whenever a pyramid is discovered, it's possible to dig through that pyramid and find a former pyramid. And in fact, here in Mexico, pyramids are built upon pyramids, so that you might have an original structure that goes back 2,000 years, and the latest structure was only built 500 years ago. But to look at the structure and say, okay, well, this is only 500 years old, this is superficial examination. So, the Mahabharata, by its stories and its flow, teaches us that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, in the words of Newton. And if one of the messages of the book is to search out the original cause of action, we discover that this search involves a kind of infinite regression, one that looks at karmic cause and effect, but ultimately will take us to the ultimate cause and the ultimate effect, which is spiritual, which is metaphysical, God, and begins to unravel the problem of God and the soul. And so it is that we see that karma, or the endless cycle of action and reaction of physical cause and effect, is one of the great themes of the Mahabharata. So not only is Vyas a great storyteller, telling a great story, but he's also touching on great themes. And one of the particular geniuses that Vyas demonstrates is that not only the Mahabharata itself is a story of infinite regression, but the story of every human life is like the matrushka, a story of infinite regression, because one must consider one's former life and the life before that and the life before that. And this way we begin to get an understanding of the wheel of time, or the wheel of birth and death, the wheel of karma. So the Mahabharata not only tells us about a great battle between different individuals, but it reveals something about the karmic life of those different individuals, and demonstrates that we all live a sort of tangled series of lives, each one embedded in our former karma. And even as we live off the reactions of our past life, we create new karma for our next life. So karma itself is a kind of infinite regression into the past and the future in the form of a wheel. But karma itself is not infinite in an absolute sense. The soul is eternal and will one day escape this apparently infinite circle of birth and death. Nevertheless, we're bound in that circle. Karma binds us in that circle, like a kind of Mobius strip of action and reaction. So, if it's true that the soul ultimately becomes liberated, we become free from karma and birth and death. But this life here in the mortal world, this kind of myth of Sisyphus, the ancient Greek who was condemned to roll a rock up a hill, and when the rock reached the top, it would roll back down to the bottom. Mahabharata teaches us that the Sisyphean task of birth, death, and rebirth is not eternal, but as long as we refuse to seek out our immortal life, the circle of karma is endless. So one of the internal meanings of the Mahabharata, beyond the simple mythology of the struggle between gods and demons, or good and evil at the Battle of Kurukshetra, beyond this tale that we're being told, Vyasa is encouraging us to look for a deeper meaning, to try to understand the characteristic of the immortal soul. And so we see the genius of Vyasadeva not only in telling the greatest story and creating this mysterious structure of infinite regression, but we also see the genius of Vyas in dealing with the problem of karma. We find, for example, that a hero is cursed in his former life and struggles through the karmic reaction, and in this life, finding a happy ending only in the next. Or a villain blessed with good karma from his last life squanders his chances and is reborn in misery. In this way we see different lives, different generations, and different concatenations of karma cycling through. And it's much more interesting or fascinating to us to have the law of karma revealed to us in the stories. Whereas if someone simply explains, well, there's action and reaction, and you better be careful about how that will play out, it doesn't capture our imagination in exactly the same way. So Vyasa is using his genius as a storyteller to move us into a deeper understanding of action and reaction. And sometimes his time frame goes beyond a single life and may include multiple incarnations of the same character, personality. So his exploration of karma reflects the wheel of birth and death itself. Heroes become villains, friends become foes, and foes become friends. Vyas tries to teach us to involve ourselves in some self-reflection and ferret out why are we in a particular situation according to our karma. Uh, he also reminds us that this is a very subtle process. It's not easy to understand. It involves the action and reaction of our past life. And he also reminds us that salvation will be found when we get past the cycle of repeated birth and death and find our true harmony. And the process of doing so is seen in different kinds of yoga, especially profoundly discussed in the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna reveals different levels of yoga to Arjuna. And so it is that as the narrative progresses, the Mahabharata contemplates the actions and reactions that take place over a number of past lives. And in this sense, its scope in time is infinite. It's not limited to 10 days of action on a battlefield, or as in the Iliad, or the 18 days of the Kurukshetra war. But you can take any character on the battlefield, from Duryodhana to Drona to Bhishma, Arjuna, Yudhishthira, and go back in time and see their former life, and then fast forward to see their future life. And given that you have a cast of thousands and thousands of different lives, past, present, and future, Vyasa's achievement is much more ambitious than any other epic. And this is a reason why the Mahabharata is often misunderstood, because critics are unable to grasp this kind of scope if they feel that we have only one life, and that any discussion of past life or future life is some sort of unusual, supernatural, magic thinking. Then they tend to discount all those different stories, backstories, tales, legends, histories about former lives and former kings, and want to excise that from the action of the epic. And in this way, they end up creating an entirely different work. The Mahabharata can be interpreted on a number of different levels, on the level of a tale or a story or fable or legend, on the level of a kind of epic. But this is a very mundane level on which to interpret this great work. A deeper level is to take up the ethical consideration of dharma, which Vyasa is constantly hitting on, above and beyond having created a great literary work, a great metaphysical work, a great structure which is infinite in scope, and a great discussion of karma. Vyasa continuously comes back to the question of ethics, of morality, of dharma. And what is dharma, and how does that play out? Apart from the great theme of karma, or action and reaction, there's another great theme, which is the problem of what is good and what is bad, good and evil, right action. And this is called dharma. So how one's dharma plays out and how that influences one's karma is another big theme in the Mahabharata. But if we try to correct Vyasa's version and excise the aspects of the Mahabharata which appear to be supernatural, what happens is we become unable to explore his deeper theme, which is that of dharma. So all this is part of the rich fabric that has been woven by Vyas, or, if you like, the the Russian doll or the matryoshka. So we open a larger doll to find a smaller one within that contains a still smaller doll, as if we're sitting in a barber's chair looking at the mirror before us and seeing the mirror behind us. The mirrors reveal an infinite number of selves. So this effect, coming back to my point about infinite regression, this effect allows us to contemplate our place in the universe as an individual soul, passing through a myriad number of incarnations. So, getting back to my comparison of the Mahabharata with other great books in the Western literary canon, the temporal planes found in the Mahabharata then easily surpass and eclipse the Bible, Homer, 1001 Nights. Not only do we have a cast of thousands of characters, but our understanding of their past and former lives is endless in scope. Now, the study of Mahabharata began before the birth of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great went to India somewhere around 500 BC. He was stopped at the Indus River, or the Sindhu River, by a king named Puru. And an epic poem about Puru was written by Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Eventually Puru was conquered, and Alexander got a little bit further and penetrated a bit of India, but had to return. And in doing so, he managed to collect a number of books that were later preserved in the Alexandrian Library in Egypt, and later fell into the hands of the Greeks. Now, the books in the Alexandrian Library provoked thinkers in Greece, such as Plotinus, to develop their ideas about ideal realism. And we know that among those books were collected the Mahabharata, the grammar of Panini, and many other different kinds of literatures. In India, history was not taken as seriously as it is in the West. In the West, different powerful kings wanted to record their every move and action, and had the poets write about them. But in India, the focus was on spiritual life. So we know that the Mahabharata was collected sometime around the 5th century before Christ. But when exactly the book was compiled is hard to say. I would argue that since this is the greatest epic in the Sanskrit language, and since the grammar of Panini was also collected around 500 BC, 2 points stand out. One, Panini's grammar must have been older than 500 years before Christ. Simply that it was collected around that time doesn't mean it was written then. It may have been it may have been written 200 years before it was collected. Then again, a grammar is written to encode things that are already in practice and have been in practice in a language for a long time. So that if Panini's grammar goes back to 700 or 800 years before Christ, and if that grammar is referring to the rules of a language long established with a great history of poetry, then the books written in that language must predate the grammar, again, at least by another 200 or 300 years. That takes us back to 1,000 years before Christ. According to scholars like Aryabhata, writing in the 5th century before Christ, his astrological calculations put the Battle of Kurukshetra at 3,102 years before Christ. And so we might make an argument with a certain amount of confidence that the Mahabharata must have been written somewhere between 3000 BC and 1000 BC. Long before it was collected by Alexander the Great. So this is quite an achievement to have created a literature that has withstood so many thousands of years. And one of the reasons why the Mahabharata has withstood the test of time is precisely because it touches on these great themes like karma, dharma, and the problem of time, creation, God, metaphysics. If modern criticism would excise these from the book, then they would leave us with a very poor edition indeed. So, I think I'll wrap up my discussion of the Mahabharata this morning here. I don't want to go on too long, but I wanted to touch on a few of the major themes of the work, and I'll try to continue speaking more later. I hope you found this edifying. Sorry about my throat clearing. I hope that doesn't deteriorate the sound quality at all. And thanks for tuning in and checking us out. I'm going to try to keep doing this regularly. All right, so bye.